Hi everybody, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today I'm joined by Jonathan White, who is an assistant professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University and the recent author of Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Reelection of Abraham Lincoln, which is now out with LSU Press. So Dr. White, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is a very interesting topic. I think a lot of folks out there often refer to the cited figure that you mentioned of 78% of the Union soldier vote went to Lincoln. And I think that's a very common refrain we hear. And you really dive into this quote, so to speak, and really unpack it and prove that maybe we should be looking at this from a different angle. So why don't you start us off perhaps by just giving us a bit of a broad overview of the book in general?
Sure. Well, the book looks at how soldiers viewed the issue of emancipation really from the beginning of the war through the election of 1864 when Lincoln was reelected. And most scholars have looked at this number, 78% of the soldier vote went for Lincoln, and they assume that that means that 78% of the soldiers had really become Republicans and had come to support the Republican platform of emancipation and a 13th Amendment. And what I try to do is look at why were so many soldiers voting for Lincoln? What does that number really mean? I don't think it's as simple as just saying 80% voted for Lincoln. And ultimately what I found were there's a whole host of reasons that soldiers voted for Lincoln. Many of them surely supported Lincoln and emancipation. But many also had come to oppose the Democratic Party. They saw the Democratic Party as disloyal, especially in nominating a peace Democrat for vice president and in their platform calling the war a failure. And so my contention is that a lot of soldiers either voted for Lincoln as the lesser of two evils because they believed that he would fight to restore the Union, or many soldiers chose not to vote. And that's the issue that I think no one has ever really looked at before, is voter turnout and soldiers deciding not to vote in the election of 1864. And I think when you bring those voters into the picture, it sort of puts that 78% in context. So ultimately, 78% of the soldiers who voted for Lincoln, but probably 20 or more percent chose not to vote. And it was very easy for them to vote in that election. They just had to walk down the company street to their officer's tent. So they were making a conscious decision in not voting.
Now, I wondered if you could also speak just a little bit to what inspired you to tackle such a project.
Sure. I actually started the project when I was a senior at Penn State back in 2000, 2001. I was auditing a course with Mark Neely, who of course is one of the most important Civil War historians today. And it was his course on the Civil War and Reconstruction. And every day after class, he and I would go back to his office to talk. And we would talk about all sorts of things from the Civil War to Mark Twain to Bob Dylan, all sorts of things. And one day I asked him if he would be willing to do an independent study with me in the spring of my senior year. And he said yes, but we had to find a good topic. And so I suggested one topic, and he said, oh, that might not be a very good topic. Come back in a week and we'll talk about it. And so I went back a week later, and he had 3 topics that he knew could be done from living in central Pennsylvania at Penn State. And one of them was the soldier vote of 1864. And I'd never heard of soldiers voting during the Civil War, but this was the fall of 2000, so this was while the Bush versus Gore election fiasco was going on, and I thought an election-related topic sounded interesting. I didn't know at the time that Mark had been planning to write his own work on the soldier vote of 1864, but he instead very graciously gave it to me, and I wrote a paper for him and turned it into my first academic article, and now 14 years later, I finally turned it into a book. So there are parts of the book that I wrote when I was a college student, and I'm hoping that they don't stand out too much.
Well, I don't think that's the case at all. It's quite well written. At the beginning, after the introduction, you discuss your methodology a bit. And kind of how you approached that with this work, because obviously your source material is something that you're heavily reliant upon when you're dealing with something quant-related, I suppose you should say. So I wondered if you could just elaborate a bit more for our audience as to your methodological approach.
Sure. In the book, I bring together a lot of different types of sources. So one of the primary types of sources I use are soldiers' letters and diaries. Now, the problem that people always point out with soldiers' letters is that you can find letters to say anything you want. And so I primarily use letters as a way to supplement the other sources that I use. Now, for the other sources I use, one big group are court-martial case files, and these are at the National Archives. And I went through and I found dozens and dozens of cases of soldiers who were punished for opposing emancipation, either by speaking out against it or writing newspaper editorials against emancipation or deserting and saying, I'm not going to fight in an abolition war or an N-word war. And they desert, they do so publicly because they're Democrats, and then they get punished publicly as a way to try to dissuade other soldiers from acting alike. And what I argue in those two chapters that look at these court-martial cases is that the Lincoln administration was really trying to teach the soldiers that they needed to fight in a war for emancipation. And so they silenced opposition to Lincoln's war measures, most importantly emancipation, as a way to sort of send this message out to the soldiers. And that process then continued during the election of 1864, where I found a number of instances where soldiers who spoke out against Lincoln or emancipation during the summer and fall of 1864 were also court-martialed for doing so. And so the period of January through March 1863 and the immediate aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation is where you see this first big wave of court-martial cases, and then the run-up to the election of 1864 is where you see the second. And then the other type of source that I use are election returns. And in particular, I wanted to look at elections that were other than the presidential election. The election calendar was very strange in the 19th century, where you didn't vote for all the same offices on the same day. And so there were elections all throughout the fall, September, October, November, and then finally the presidential election in November of 1864. And soldiers could vote in those state and local elections as well. And so I wanted to see, did they vote in as high of numbers in those what we might now call off-year elections, even though they were the same year? Did they vote in as high of numbers in those elections? And they didn't. The voter turnout was much lower. And I think that shows us that they weren't as politically active as most scholars think they were. But when it came to voting for a president, or they believed it was worth voting for president because they believed Lincoln would help restore the Union. But they didn't vote as heavily Republican when it came to state and congressional elections.
Now, you've already touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if we could circle back to it just briefly. With regards to historians, prior examinations, the soldier vote of 1864, James McPherson obviously very prominently studies this amongst others. And I wondered if you could speak just a little bit to why historians in the past have kind of misread these statistics. And I guess, I'm sure to one degree it's a matter of election returns and not comparing it to other elections, but I'm sure there are other factors that maybe you could speak to.
I think the answer to that is it seems so obvious. On the one hand, it seems so obvious that 80% of the soldiers voted for Lincoln, and therefore that shows that they supported emancipation and Lincoln's reelection. And so I think for the last 150 years, people have just sort of taken that number for granted and never thought about what really got soldiers voting or not voting. And so once I began, and I actually started to think about this when I was an undergrad, and it was Professor Neely who really helped me to start thinking about this issue. Once I began to look at the contested elections in the North, where there were instances of fraud and intimidation for soldiers who were voting, it began to dawn on me that a lot of soldiers chose not to vote because they were afraid to vote Democratic or because they opposed the Democratic Party. Or in other cases, soldiers were almost coerced or even coerced into voting the Republican ticket. Soldiers were offered promotion if they would vote Republican. Sometimes they were called to publicly, they were called to stand in ranks, and the officer would say, all those who intend to vote for Lincoln, take a step forward. And those who would vote for McClellan might get sent to a more dangerous duty. In fact, I even, you publish a book and then you find a great quote after the book is out and it's too late to include in the book. I found an instance during the summer of 1864 where Secretary of War Edwin Stanton said that he found an officer who was working as a quartermaster, and the officer had bet against the Republican candidate for governor in Indiana, Oliver Morton. And Stanton, at a White House gathering, very proudly said, I reduced him in rank and sent him to the front. And so here you have the Secretary of War essentially saying people who don't toe the party line will get worse assignments in the field, more dangerous assignments in the field. And I honestly believe that a lot of soldiers who maybe were wishy-washy on the election, weren't quite sure how they were going to vote, decided to vote for Lincoln because there were some strong incentives to doing so. The other thing I'll say about that is a lot of scholars, I think, believe that the soldiers were sort of a Republican unit, that they'd become Republican by early mid 1863, and by 1864 they were solidly Republican. And my argument is that soldiers ebbed and flowed in terms of their political views. They, when the war was going well, they were enthusiastic for Lincoln, and when the war was going badly, they were not enthusiastic for their commander-in-chief. And the election of 1864 came at a time of an immense enthusiasm. Atlanta had just fallen, and so I think that also helps explain why the soldiers voted for Lincoln in such high numbers.
Now, I wondered if we could go back to this idea of different types of elections garnering different types of turnout. And I wondered if there are a couple more examples that you might be able to offer to us to kind of show this contrast between the proper presidential election and other statewide or I guess you could say congressional elections within a state.
Sure. Well, there were state elections held in Maine in September of 1864 and in Pennsylvania and Ohio in October of 64. And the turnout, for instance, in the Maine elections, they voted for members of Congress and for governor. I don't have the statistics in front of me at the moment, but the vote increased by, I want to say, 2/3 from September to November. But I even found instances of soldiers in the November elections in a few states, like Kentucky. I believe Kentucky was one of them. They had state-level elections on the same day as the presidential election. And you can look at the voter turnout for state and congressional offices, and they're lower than for the president, meaning that they really did value voting for a commander-in-chief more than for just their general party leaders.
So, Dr. White, what's the big takeaway then of this book? What do you hope the readers here who pick this up, and they should because it's a great book, what do you hope they get into their heads about the presidential election of 1864 and the soldier vote?
It's a great question. So I dedicated the book to Mark Neely because Mark Neely's, when Mark teaches graduate students, he teaches them to challenge the reigning paradigms in Civil War historiography. In other words, find the thing that everyone believes and show how it's wrong. And if you look at Neely's books and articles, you can see how he does that, oftentimes, usually very persuasively. And so I try to do that in this book. And the two takeaways, I suppose, would be, one, to understand that we've been misreading this number, this 78%, for the last 150 years, and that the soldiers were much more interested in fighting for the Union than fighting for emancipation. And then the second part of that, or the second big idea that I'm critiquing, is the self-emancipation thesis. And that's related to the first point. And the self-emancipation thesis argues that the slaves taught Union soldiers that they needed to free them, and eventually that lesson worked its way up the chain of command until it got to Congress, and then eventually Lincoln learned that he needed to free the slaves. And the prime movers in that account are the slaves themselves. And what I try to do in this book is show that we can't ignore the top-down nature of the emancipation process, that Lincoln and the War Department and the Union High Command were working very diligently to teach the soldiers that they needed to fight not only in a war for Union, but also a war for emancipation. And you can see that again in these court-martial cases where soldiers who just speak out against emancipation say, I enlisted for one reason and now I'm being forced to fight for another. When they get punished, the Lincoln administration is doing that to teach the soldiers that emancipation is worth fighting for. And I don't think that scholars have noticed that aspect of the story very much in the past.
Now, finally, Dr. White, last question for you. The infamous Next Project. What's next on your agenda here as you put this book to bed? Yeah,
well, I've actually been, for about a year and a half now, I've been working on a history of sleep and dreams during the Civil War. And I don't know how I got the idea, but I had the idea about 7 years ago. And as I've been working on other projects looking at soldiers' letters, anytime I found a mention of their dreams, I would make note of it and sort of tuck it aside. And last May, as I had finished this book, I decided to start writing about dreams during the Civil War. And so the book looks at soldiers and civilians, Union, Confederate. It's all topical. So I have chapters on soldiers' sleep, soldiers' dreams, Confederate civilians, slaves, prisoners of war, pop culture, and then on Lincoln. And it's really been fascinating to find the way that these soldiers and their spouses and their families write about their dreams. And I think it reveals something about the nature of the war that no other primary source reveals. And one of the most striking things is just how honest the soldiers and their spouses are with each other about their dreams. Briefly, I'll just say, as a tease, I suppose, that some of the most interesting dreams I found have been about infidelity. And soldiers and their wives commonly wrote to each other about dreams they had where they believed the other was being unfaithful to them. And some of these dreams get quite dramatic. I found 2 murder-suicide dreams. And the fact that soldiers would write to their wives about this sort of thing reveals, one, how honest and forthright they were, which was surprising to me thinking about this Victorian era. But 2, it also tells us a lot about the concerns that soldiers had and that their wives had while they were far away from each other. So infidelity is one of many types of dreams that come out, revealing soldiers' concerns.
Wow. Well, that sounds like a pretty fascinating new project, and one I think perhaps at times we might just take for granted. You know, people who read soldier correspondence regularly might necessarily just kind of pass over those remarks, right? Is no different than, say, the weather, right? Which is a very common thing, usually at the outset of a lot of letters. So it's reassuring to know that someone is taking a look at it through many different angles, it appears. And sounds like a remarkable book in the pipeline, I should say, book project. So,
well, I'm about 330 pages into it, so I'm hoping to be done this spring.
Wonderful.
Fingers crossed.
Well, you are quite the machine then, Dr. White, and but we appreciate you coming on and talking about your latest book. Again, everyone, that's Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Reelection of Abraham Lincoln, out with LSU Press. A great read, and I think vital to anybody who cares about Civil War politics, the life of a Civil War soldier, and perhaps looking at a critical reassessment of loyalty to the Republican Party within the Army and what that actually meant when it came to brass tacks and politics and the vote. So, Dr. White, thank you so much for coming on, and perhaps we can talk about dreams in the future.
I'll look forward to it. Thanks.